Fantasy Focus is presented by Geico. Switch to Geico and see all the ways you could save. Happy August 4th, which is an important day because I don't care if it's preseason. Football is back tonight.
Yes.
The Raiders and the Jaguars kick off our preseason slate. They play in the Hall of Fame game. After tonight, there are only 333 more NFL games to go. Let's savor them all. Field, Stephania, and Daniel here. Stephania, great to have you back. You've been busy, and you come for one day, and then you leave again because Stephania is grinding the training camp tours. We have a lot to get into today, including plenty of Stephania updates. We'll also do some double trouble that involves the Bills and the Dolphins. For those that are watching on the live stream, you can see those two helmets in front of us. But let's keep you busy, Stephania, and start with some news. You have been to several training camps so far. Which ones have you been to up to this point?
Jacksonville Jaguars and Miami Dolphins.
Okay, so 2 so far. You've got many more ahead of you. But let's begin in Jacksonville. Travis Etienne, of course, missed the entirety of last year due to a foot injury. What did you learn in Jacksonville when you visited them?
It's always one of the great things about camp is you get to actually talk to the players. You get to hear from them about their injury. So Travis Etienne had a Lisfranc injury. You guys probably remember it was the start of the season last year. It was actually the second preseason game when it happened. So he's now coming up on a full year of recovery. And he told me how it happened. He felt a pop in his foot, couldn't run on it, knew he was going to have surgery right away. And look, the time frame is good for him. He's doing everything in camp. That's what you need to know for fantasy purposes. No limitations on him. Still getting acclimated, sort of an endurance perspective for him at the running back position. Not going to play tonight. They're still going to protect him a little bit longer. But it was interesting in talking to him. One of the best quotes that I have gotten, well, I've only been to 2 camps, but in all of the camps I do, he talked about rehab, said he had to fall in love with the mundane. And I was like, that is exactly, anyone who's been through a big injury knows that's exactly what you have to do. It is boring, it is long, and you have to make it interesting so that you stick with it. But the other thing is, he talked about working side by side with James Robinson and how they sort of motivated each other. And James Robinson doing drills, but not actively involved in like 11 on 11s. He's still relegated to individual work primarily. But Travis Etienne, what I can tell you is he looks fantastic. Yeah. He is getting a lot of action, and I think they have big plans for him this year.
Only sort of, again, strengthens my take that I've had, that we've discussed previously on the show, which is that I think Travis Etienne could end up being one of the value plays at running back. I've got him at 19, which is ahead of his current ADP. James Robinson drafted right now as running back at 34. I think as he gets further along in his recovery, we'll feel a little better, a little more certain they'll have an actual role in this offense.
I think one thing to say about James Robinson, I've talked about this before, when they're not on the PUP list, right. So that means they can start the season on time, assuming that that they want them to start the season on time, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be up to their full workload by the time they start the year. It means that they're going to see how they respond, and one of the ways you test it is by doing football activity. So by easing him in position drills at first, and then maybe situational drills, and you gradually see how does his Achilles respond. He's only about 8 months out right now, and as that workload increases, will he play week 1? We don't know yet. And even if he does, will he have the full James Robinson role? We don't know that yet. It's not automatic.
Yeah. Stephania, I want to talk about the Cowboys wide receivers because unfortunately there are a lot of wide receivers for you to be able to talk about within this wide receiving core. James Washington specifically out 6 to 10 weeks leaves a thin wide receiving core even thinner. But what can you tell us about James Washington? Is he somebody that potentially has the ability to come back after that 10-week time period and be something for fantasy managers?
Yeah, he has a Jones fracture, so fracture in the 5th metatarsal. It's the outside of the foot. These are pretty common. We see him in wide receivers, defensive backs, even offensive linemen, and usually hear this 6 to 10 week time frame. Well, guys come back. We've seen it. Des Bryant came back. Julian Edelman came back. Sometimes there is a re-injury. That is the risk because it takes up to 6 months for the bone to fully remodel. Sure. But they often can come back to play. So it really depends on how his recovery goes. Is there any pain left? Once the pain clears, they clear them for activity as long as the bone shows good healing. And he has a chance to be productive for the back half of the season.
Yeah, we talked about the Cowboys. the other day, Field, and understanding that this wide receiving core right now, all of them are banged up. Michael Gallup and Jalen Tolbert as well. So CeeDee Lamb looking like he's going to get a lot of targets early on. We'll see how the rest of that wide receiver core works out.
Did I miss something on Jalen Tolbert? Tolbert's banged up right now as well. Did I miss something?
No, I'm sorry. Did I say he was banged up?
Okay, just in case. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. But Tolbert currently healthy. It's just that basically everybody else besides CeeDee Lamb is banged up. Debo is willing to do whatever it takes. Stephania, you're going to go to 49ers camp later on this weekend. You can ask him about that. If this was news or noise, I would tell you it's noise. Like, what would you expect him to say? A. B, like, he's got the bag now. Like, the concerns about overexerting yourself as a running back are not nearly as legitimate as they were before the contract is done. So Debo saying that he's going to do whatever it takes, that to me is noise. But what I will say is, as far as we are concerned, I'd much prefer Debo to be first half of last year Debo than second half of last year Debo. And if you're sitting there saying to yourself, he was like the best player in the NFL for the second half of last season, you're not wrong. But Debo scored on 14% of his carries last year. Think about that. 14% of his rushes went for a touchdown. That would be like if Derrick Henry scored 50 rushing touchdowns in a season off of his usual workload. Debo was unbelievable. He also kept finding the end zone. In the first 8 games of last year, he had 81 targets as a true wide receiver when he was not being used as a running back. I would much rather bank on 10 targets a game turning into massive fantasy production than somewhere between like 6 and 12 carries a game turning into massive fantasy production. So Debo, I get why you're willing to do whatever it takes, but if you go into Kyle Shanahan's office later today and tell him I actually only want to be a wide receiver, this is just you and me, Debo, talking, I don't care. I'm totally cool with that. That would be great.
That would be awesome.
Daniel, and pick things back up from here.
Here's the thing. I realize you got a little impassioned. We sort of stepped out and let Field have his Debo moment. But I'm with you on Debo for the record. I just want the guy to be involved in the offense, and the fact that he's back, no questions asked, we're good to go.
I believe I said a long time ago this was going to work itself out. I think everybody in the Bay Area thought it was going to work itself out, and they did. And Kyle said we're on the same page. We'll see. Yeah. They'll use him how they need to use him, and Debo will do what Debo does.
So, Stephania, Irv Smith, tight end for the Minnesota Vikings right now, currently undergoes thumb surgery, expected to be ready for week 1. At a tight end position, we've talked about how the Vikings are looking to potentially throw more this year. Yes. Hopefully somebody that you could see Irv Smith as a young tight end take a step forward. But how does this thumb surgery potentially impact his early season
I've been
work?
really high on Irv Smith because he missed all of last year with the knee injury. Remember, he had meniscus tear, had a repair, was out the entire year. And they planned to use him as a receiver. And they didn't say exactly what happened to his thumb yet. So we don't know the exact nature of the injury. But this is from Kevin O'Connell. He basically said it was just on a simple block, how the injury happened. But what he said that I think is important for fantasy purposes is he said if it was another position where catching the football isn't such a necessity like it is for a guy like Irv, we might tape that thing up and get him right back out there, but we wanted to fix it and use this time smartly and make sure we give Irv the best chance to have a great 2022 season. So to me, that tells you, just reinforces the idea that they are planning on him catching a lot of passes. They did not want the thumb to be an issue for the year.
Interesting. So Irv is a guy we've all been enamored by since he got drafted. He was a player that slid to the second round. Then you thought he'd be in the first round. Very good athlete. Passing offense that we think is going to potentially take a step forward this year. I think the complicating factor is that while he's expected to be ready for the first week of the season, if there's any level of doubt, when you're sifting through those tight ends that aren't Travis Kelce and Darren Waller and George Kittle types, that may be enough to break the tie and push you towards somebody else, maybe like a Dawson Knox we'll be discussing in just a little bit later on, or a Mike Gesicki, who we'll also be talking about a little bit later on, because you have the certainty of having that player available for week 1, whereas Irv Smith, you're either doubling up on tight ends or you're having to use your IR spot on Irv Smith, and that prevents you from using it on somebody who might have greater value early on in the season, who plays running back or wide receiver, who's just currently banged up.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get a clue, because hopefully he'll be back catching passes and practice and doing enough that you have a better idea when you're drafting.
Stephania, this is a big show. This is going to be your first double trouble of the year. Do you think you're ready for this?
Probably not.
Let's get into Bills Dolphins.
Before we do that, though, I am being told we have some breaking news.
Oh, breaking news.
Yeah, we have some breaking news. I'm being told that we might even have a drop for it as well. Maybe not. Maybe yes. Maybe not.
Maybe so.
We're going to try this. We're just going to do. We need like a...
ESPN Radio breaking news.
Okay. All right. So here's what I'm being told. I'm being told by a very reliable source, like extremely reliable, like the most reliable source I've ever had in my entire reporting career, that fantasy football doesn't mean anything to Bill Belichick. And if you're sitting there wondering, what do you mean fantasy football means nothing to Bill Belichick? How do you know that? Did you ask him? No, I didn't ask him. Believe it or not, I have not asked Bill Belichick that. But Bill Belichick said this morning in a press conference, quote,
Somebody asked
fantasy
him.
football doesn't mean anything to me. Now, here's what I got to say.
Come on, Field, you know him. Is that
I
true?
love this. My guess is it's very true. My guess is very true, Stephania. And we're going to talk about the Patriots on Double Trouble tomorrow. The Patriots are like, my theme for the Patriots this year, and we'll talk about it tomorrow, is like strength in numbers, right? Like they got a bunch of players who are good at football. I don't know how many players, as I stand here right now, are absolute stone cold locks to be in a lineup in a 10-team league from the New England Patriots week 1 of this season. There may be 0. There's a case that there are 0.
No.
10-team league, not going to happen.
No. But I meant like as he'll be out there every week.
Oh, no. I'm not talking about who's going to be available for them. I'm saying who's going to be available for our fantasy lineup, right? I mean, this is Bill Belichick, the champion of running backs by committee and 2 tight end sets and wide receivers that are all pretty good, right? We'll talk about this more tomorrow. But the Patriots wide receivers, I think their Madden ratings might all literally be identical. I think Madden just says Patriots wide receiver, you automatically get a 76, right? There's no 94 Patriots receiver. There's no 54 Patriots receiver. They're all just 76s. It was a great line there from Bill Belichick. He does not care about your fantasy football team. He does not care about fantasy football in general. Least surprising thing that I've ever heard out of Bill Belichick. And to be honest with you, I think it's reflective of how a lot of head coaches feel.
Yeah. It's just that Bill doesn't mind saying it. Got no problem with it. Field, I like that little rant. I like these little mini Field rants. This has been the second little mini Field rant I've had.
All right, so we're going to get to Double Trouble, which it is time for. And now, hit that drop.
Double trouble.
Double trouble.
Double trouble. Double trouble.
As of this moment, they're on double secret probation.
All right, we're going to start with the Bills. And I think the one question that we're going to ask, that I want to ask, is Josh Allen just in a QB tier of his own this year within fantasy football?
Yeah. I don't think so. So I think Josh Allen is to me, he has a clear case as the number 1 quarterback in fantasy football. I don't think he's in a tier by himself, though. I think that Patrick Mahomes is knocking on that door. And I've said this before. I think there are 5 quarterbacks who are in tier 1 for me. I'd also add Justin Herbert, Lamar Jackson, and Tom Brady. That being said, I think Josh Allen's case for the number 1 quarterback in the NFL is pretty obvious. If you were to make a list of the 5 quarterbacks in the NFL who are most likely in any given week to throw for 400 yards, Josh Allen is a lock for that list, right? Any disagreement there?
Nope.
Okay. If you were to make a list of the 5 quarterbacks who are most likely to rush for at least, let's call it 70 yards and a touchdown in a given week, is Josh Allen on that list?
Yes.
Also, yes. I don't think there's another quarterback in the NFL that is as certain of a case to be in both of those top 5s, right? Mm-hmm. To wit, last year and the past year, over the past 2 seasons, Josh Allen is the only quarterback in the NFL that has at least 30 passing touchdowns and at least 400 rushing yards. His floor is set by his really good passing ability and his really good rushing ability. It also happens to be the ceiling, and that's why we're talking about him as a ceiling play. So yes, if you gave me my choice of any quarterback that I could have in fantasy football this season, to me, it is Josh Allen, and it is a clear number 1 overall pick amongst quarterbacks. I think he's going to win the NFL MVP this year. I've said that many times this offseason. His fantasy upside is limitless, and his floor is just so stinking high, right? Even in games. Last year, I think the worst game I saw Josh Allen play in real life was against the Falcons late in the season. It was this weird, snowy game. He had 3 interceptions, and then he bull rushed for like 55 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. And I look at my app, and all of a sudden he's got 22.5 fantasy points in a game where he played poorly. Josh Allen's a cheat code amongst quarterbacks. He really is.
I think
there's no need to follow that
Yeah.
up. I took him first overall in Scott Fishbowl, also because he doesn't make a lot of mistakes, especially in the red zone.
Yeah.
Virtually no interceptions in the red zone.
And we're going to talk later just to get people. So I don't think having him as your number 1 quarterback is that audacious of a take this year in fantasy. The bigger question with Josh, and we'll discuss it a little bit deeper later on in the show, is when you take the number 1 quarterback or when you take Josh Allen in your drafts. That has always been the bigger conversation surrounding the top quarterbacks. We'll dive into it a bit.
All right. Will Devin Singletary, Field Yates, do you believe with the addition of James Cook, with the way that it feels like Zach Moss has sort of been phased out of this offense. Will Devin Singletary have enough to be able to have a lead role in this backfield and be fantasy relevant as an RB2 type play for you, or a flex play, a high-end flex play on a weekly basis?
I'm more on the low-end flex play. And here's the reason why. Devin Singletary was red hot at the end of last season. Last 5 weeks of the year. Here are some important things to know. He had nearly 19 touches per game, and he had nearly 20 fantasy points per game. Now, worth noting that down the stretch, he just kept scoring touchdowns every single week, it felt like. That's hard to do, right? Especially when you are a guy who has a quarterback like Josh Allen, who still is the best goal line threat on this roster if you're going to run the ball from 1 yard or 2 yards or 3 yards and in. You also have an elite passing offense. So I don't think that week 14 through 18 stretch is likely to become the norm. This is a backfield by committee. Zach Moss was in and out of the doghouse last year, but still on the roster. And then more importantly, they use a draft pick on James Cook, the younger brother of Dalvin, player at Georgia, awesome pass catcher. He's going to have a role in that regard. And I just think that Devin Singletary it reminds me of the conversation we had a little bit surrounding Miles Sanders yesterday. They're going to be a handful of weeks where Devin Singletary, I think, gets 15 or 18 touches. But I think there are going to be some other weeks where it's just a true split committee, and he might have 10 touches in a week. He might have 8. And the Bills are notorious for not throwing the football to running backs very much. Singletary had 40 catches last year on 50 targets, but those 40 catches totaled like 230 yards. Like, it's pretty much only when they're in trouble do they target backs, right? It's dump downs only. So,
and they just drafted James Cook as a pass catching running back.
So the opportunity for that is diminishing.
Yeah, if they're going to throw the ball on design plays to a running back, it feels like James Cook's going to be the guy that's getting the, either lining up in the slot opportunities, maybe some of the designed screens. And again, just remember, like, this team has Stefan Diggs, Gabe Davis, Josh Allen, Dawson Knox. Like, if they throw the football more than anybody else in terms of percentage of plays this year, I would applaud them, right? I would say, Ken Dorsey, your new offensive coordinator. That's great. And that's worth noting. They do have a new offensive coordinator. It's the same system, right, that Ken Dorsey's going to run as Brian Daboll. He has inferred that it's largely going to be similar principles, but we'll see how many tweaks he makes. If one of those tweaks is involving the running backs much more in the passing game, that's good news for Devin Singletary, but I think it's probably better news for James Cook.
Heck yeah. I'm with you there. Stephania, I want to ask you about Stefan Diggs, who has been unbelievable.
You guys kind of share the same first name.
I know. It's funny because my name's not that common, right? So when people say Stefan, it gets my attention, right?
Yeah.
Right.
He only had 2 games last year with 100 yards, which seems crazy to me. For everything that Stefan Diggs was last year, it felt like every other big-name wide receiver delivers on these 100-yard games throughout the course of the season, and Stefan Diggs was just consistency and receptions, and I don't know from this year if you look at Stefan Diggs as a guy that you can take in the first round or if you're going to wait a little bit. And I'm curious for you, is Stefan Diggs a wide receiver that you would look to target in the first?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, because I think that just what you said, volume and consistency. He led all wide receivers in end zone targets, 7 more than any other wide receiver. He is not necessarily going to give you the huge yardage per game, but he's certainly going to give you consistency in fantasy points. Josh Allen trusts him. He's going to look for him. I think Stefan Diggs, regardless of who else is going to be a pass catcher on that offense, whether it's Gabriel Davis, whether it's now running back James Cook, whether it's Dawson Knox, I think that Stefan Diggs is clearly the number 1 target for them. And I think the touchdowns will be there.
Yeah.
This falls back to something that I think we're going to discuss a lot with some of the elite players. Is I'm fine if Stefan Diggs goes inside the first 10 picks. He's more of a mid in a 10-team league, by the way, more of like a middle of the second round pick for me. And that's only because I will continue to prioritize early some of these elite running backs, and I have Diggs 5th on my wide receiver board, right? So if you just do the math, if you assume 5, maybe 6 or 7 first-round running backs, 4 other wide receivers ahead of him in line, and potentially a Travis Kelce, maybe even a Mark Andrews. That's why I have him more in the middle of the second round. But I think Stefan Diggs will have a much more consistent year this year. Unfortunately, when we're looking back on last year, we're comparing it to like this historical season the year before when he was breaking all these Bills records. But you're not going to regret a Stefan Diggs pick. I just think if you're taking him in the first round, there are other players at the wide receiver spot that I think just represent slightly more upside, either given their age or given their Cooper Kuppness.
So who do you have ahead of him?
The 4 wide receivers I have, this is in order: Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I'm very puzzled with the Raiders offense. I would put Stefan Diggs ahead of Devontae Adams more because I have concerns about the Raiders than Devontae and his skill set for sure.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't know. I like the receiver in a high power, in a potent offense that's going to do a lot of scoring. And I think the opportunity for him is fantastic.
And so I think part of this question is for Stefan Diggs is last year we saw Gabe Davis really come on towards the end of last year. He's never been a full-time player, but Gabe Davis is somebody that everybody in fantasy circles has been talking about all offseason. Was a value. Now I feel like he's at the point where, is Gabe Davis still a value with where he's being drafted, or is he just more appropriately valued with where he's being drafted?
So I think Gabe Davis is getting close to being drafted at his peak value, which is right now it's wide receiver 29 as his current ADP. We are all enamored by that 8-catch, 201 yard, 4-touchdown performance in Kansas City. And it was a reminder that, like, even if you haven't done it a ton in the past, you can grow into a larger role because of your personal development or because of departures, and you could become a star player. And we're always looking for that guy that makes the leap. Gabe Davis is super talented. He is also now, I would think, a better bet to be the Bills' number 2 wide receiver. Cole Beasley is gone. Emmanuel Sanders remains unsigned. It's Stefan Diggs, and they're looking for that next man up. I like Gabe Davis. I think his talent is extremely, extremely, extremely impressive. He's a good deep play threat as well. I think he's getting close to being drafted at peak value at wide receiver 29. I've got him exactly at wide receiver 29 in my rankings. Our good friend Eric Moody, who you'll be hearing from on this podcast, has an article about players and values, and one of the guys he dug into was Gabe Davis. And if you're kind of looking for the counterpoints to Gabe Davis, it's partly that he hasn't shown it consistently yet, and also partly if you look at like his catch percentage, the number of targets he has versus the number of catches he hauls in, it's lower than you might expect for a guy that we think could break out. And that's because he's a big vertical threat, right? And even when you have Josh Allen as your quarterback, vertical passes are just a lot more difficult to complete than the ones at or near the line of scrimmage. But I love the player a lot, and he could be one of the breakout players in fantasy football this season.
Field, you kind of mentioned it already. I don't know if you want to talk about it or if we need to touch on it anymore. But when you look at no more Emmanuel Sanders, no more Cole Beasley, we're looking at who that number 3 potentially could be in that offense. And I think this year you're looking at either Isaiah McKenzie or you're looking at James Crowder. And so I'm curious, is there any semblance either way as to which way you think this is going to go? And are either one of them really draftable right now in a 10 or 12 team fantasy league?
I'm taking a flyer on Isaiah McKenzie. And if you're asking why him versus Jamison Crowder.
Why him versus Jamison Crowder?
Yeah. I saw so many flashes from him last year, right? We all did, especially late in the season. He had that unbelievable game against the Patriots. It was like week 16 or 17 last year. It was one of those nominees for like the random game that nobody saw coming in our end of the year season awards. He's a talented guy. He was retained by Buffalo, and we talk about like, does the money matter? I think he got 2 years and $8 million. Jamison Crowder got 1 year and like up to $4 million. Crowder's a good player. He's been an accomplished slot guy. That being said, I think McKenzie's a more talented guy, and the slot role has been important to Buffalo in recent years. They rank in the top 5 in terms of slot targets over their past. They were last season. They were ranked top 5 in slot targets last year specifically. Now, maybe part of that is because Cole Beasley was a really talented slot guy, but I think Isaiah McKenzie, when he played the Cole Beasley role, and Beasley, of course, missed a game due to COVID protocols, he looked like supersized Cole Beasley in terms of fantasy impact. So I'm taking the flyer on Isaiah McKenzie.
Actually, I'll go the other direction. I'll take Jamison Crowder. I think Jamison Crowder's got a ton of talent. He was obviously had injuries early in his career, and then he went to the Jets. Yeah. So, and if you look at the quarterbacks that we're throwing to him, it was Sam Darnold, Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, Mike White. Like now he gets Josh Allen, and I think really this opportunity, this could be the year that makes Jamison Crowder's talent apparent to everyone.
that.
Yeah, he's already. I do have some concerns about the soft tissue injury history, and I think he's already dealing with a little hamstring tightness already this season. But if we can get past that, I think he might change some minds about him. And I think the fact that he's there on a 1-year deal is interesting. So
I like both of these
motivating.
guys really late in best ball drafts, specifically because I don't have to choose the weeks that they're going to pop, but knowing that one of them potentially could be the wide receiver 3. And in like you said, in this slot offense, you could have some huge weeks if I don't have to choose. Just saying, if you play best ball, I really like.
And hey,
both
the
of them
Bills
there.
are probably the offense, or they're on the short list of offenses that could carry the most players that have fantasy relevance this year.
Exactly.
Yep. Stephania, Dawson Knox. Let's finish this off with some tight ends. Last year, Dawson Knox finished as tight end 9 with 10.9 points per game. Only 49 catches, though, and he was basically carried by getting 9 touchdowns. In an offense led by Josh Allen, and how often this offense scores, that's something that I guess you could say, well, I expect him to still be involved again. But do you think that he was too touchdown reliant last year, and does he need to have more volume this year in order to repeat that top 10 tight end status he had?
It's interesting because part of it, he was banged up a lot. He had rib injuries. He had things where he would be in the game, but he wasn't able to play in the way that maybe he would have been. So I don't think they weren't targeting him as much because he was playing through a lot of pain at times. They have O.J. Howard now, too, which I think is interesting, and I'm not sure how they're going to use him. O.J. Howard, obviously, former first-round draft pick, but who had an injury history with Tampa Bay that they brought in. I don't know that he's going to be a threat to Dawson Knox in the pass catching, but he's certainly another cog in the wheel out there. I still like Dawson Knox as a pass-catching tight end, but to me, he's more middle of the pack. Like, he's not necessarily a tight end that I'm targeting when I think there are others who are going to be more consistent on a week-to-week basis.
I feel he's more like the tight end that I take when it's like, shoot, all the other tight ends are gone, and I want to make sure I don't grab people after this. Okay, I'm going to get Dawson Knox because at least he's in a good offense.
Yeah, I mean, the closest comparison for him last year was Hunter Henry, 2 guys who did not have a ton of catches, but they had a ton of touchdowns. I think Dawson Knox is the better bet to be the touchdown scoring repeater this year, just because he plays in such a good offense, and he was really, 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 really useful in the red zone last year. So, on the one hand, this is like, angel devil, right? Like, Mike Clay is sitting here telling me like, there's no way you can have nearly 20% of your catches go for touchdowns in back-to-back years, right? Regression, exactly. On the other hand, I'm sitting thinking to myself, if there was an offense where it's likely, it's probably the Buffalo Bills. So I'm actually in on Dawson Knox. I've got him at tight end 10 right now. I think that's a fair value. But Daniel, you're probably right. Like, he doesn't have enough volume to be in. Like, if he only has five touchdowns this year, I don't think he's going to pay off in terms of investment. Whereas somebody like, as an example, like TJ Hawkinson or guys who are just ahead of him in our rankings, like Hawk could have Dallas Goedert, Dalton Schultz, like they could have 75 catches this year. Dalton Schultz more specifically.
800 yards.
800 yards and 5 touchdowns, and be a better value in the end of the season than somebody like Dawson Knox if he only has 5 touchdowns.
Right now, Caesars has the Bills at 11.5 wins this year. Taking the over, the under on it.
I'll take the over.
Over?
Yeah, I'm taking the over. I mean, Josh Allen, my MVP pick. This just in, the Bills, my Super Bowl pick.
Really, really good.
Yeah,
those
they're
are going to be
super
really good.
loaded. This feels like a year that could be theirs.
All right, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Miami Dolphins. Stefania's going to fill in us a ton with all the stuff she's done. But first, Field.
When it comes to choosing the top running back, wide receiver, quarterback, or even which defense is right for your team on any given week, you know where to turn. But when you're trying to decide on the right credit card for your wallet, the right mortgage lender for your dream home, or the right savings account, where do you go? The nerds at NerdWallet are here to help you make a smart financial decision. NerdWallet is a personal finance site run by money nerds. Think people as obsessed about personal finance as we are about fantasy football, who want to share their knowledge with our listeners to help them find the right financial products for them. Let's say you're looking for a new rewards credit card. NerdWallet can help you compare cashback cards side by side so you can feel confident choosing the one that suits your spending. Think of them like your weekly wide receiver PPR rankings, but you're comparing top credit cards that work for you. Ready to make a financial decision? Compare and find top credit cards, savings accounts, and more at NerdWallet.com. NerdWallet, the smartest decision for all your financial decisions. NerdWallet Compare Inc. and MLS 1617539 NerdWallet is not an investment advisor nor an investment broker. Information is for educational purposes only.
All right, we are talking Miami Dolphins, and Hot Ticket is brought to you by Vivid Seats, where you earn rewards with every purchase. Vivid Seats Rewards is your ticket to more tickets. Vivid Seats, life happens live. And Stephania, you are back from making your rounds in Florida. I want to know
It was the hot ticket, all right.
Yeah,
It's like 95 degrees down there.
Well, so on part of that, who was the hot ticket at Dolphins camp while you were down there?
Listen,
Stephania was. To be fair,
yes,
you were
that's
there.
fair.
Everybody
You know
was
what,
sitting there
fair.
like,
Clear,
wow, Stephania
yeah.
Bell graces with their presence. She was the hot ticket.
Was
You can
not-
just say it.
all right. Okay. I don't
So
even know.
bashful. It's
I know.
okay.
Great
I know.
moment.
Whatever.
It's so
I was
cute.
hot for sure.
I love you.
I don't know about hot, but I was hot. Look, the hot ticket is so obvious. It's Tyreek Hill. I mean, you hear all the chatter, and it's funny that, again, that's why I love going to camp, because sort of from the distance, what I heard going in, Tyreek bragging about his quarterback. Tyreek is still fast. But people worried like, oh, Tyreek, is he just going to be there to catch the deep ball, and is Tua going to only throw him the deep ball? Okay. So those narratives are a little bit tired, especially in this Mike McDaniel offense, where I think he sees Tyreek Hill as a player he could utilize a little bit like they did Deebo Samuel. And what I mean by that is the versatility. So obviously Tyreek Hill has speed. And by the way, they have speed competition every day. Mike McDaniel reports in like who was the fastest in practice. And these guys literally, they wait for him to tell them who had the fastest time, because they have all that wearable data, right? So every day it's competition. Tyreek Hill takes great pride being the fastest. Raheem Mostert was faster than him one day, but Tyreek Hill is the fastest consistently. And so you can see that speed on display when they're practicing. And what it does is no matter where he lines up, you start thinking everybody's got to account for him in the speed, and it opens up things for the rest of the offense. So Tyreek Hill is the focal point, but he is changing what they can do. Also, he wasn't just utilized on deep bombs. I saw Tua make a big 35-yard throw to him down the field. But when he carried the ball a few times. I mean, they're utilizing him as a running back in certain situations. He can get around the edge so fast that I just think Tyreek Hill isn't just a deep threat. If that's what people are remembering from Kansas City, I think he's got a lot more to offer. There's so much that they're setting up in terms of, pre-snap motion and misdirection plays that I think is going to really change the way this Miami Dolphins offense looks.
Heck yeah.
And he is making Tua a more confident quarterback because they're building that relationship there.
And fingers crossed, because that's what it is that we are looking for here from Tua, is a more confident Tua that is going to take the next step forward. And I want to ask both of you, Stefania, I want to start with you, just with Tua coming back from injury. How does he look? How concerned are you about him being on the field this year before we talk about, whether or not he can be more than what he's been in the past?
I definitely think that you're going to see a different Tua this year. I mean, he looks the part. He looks more confident. He's making plays that I don't think he was making before, and that comes with time. But I think what people forget is this injury was so severe when it happened. Some people might never have played a sport again. Like, this was a really bad injury. And then he comes off. He had an amazing surgeon, but to do that hip surgery, they have to slice through a lot of muscles there. And what do we talk about when quarterbacks, when they deliver their throw, it comes from strength in their core and their legs. Well, he didn't have that because of the surgery that he had. So when people talk about him throwing off the back foot, he didn't have drive through his bottom half until really he's just now starting to feel like the quarterback he was at Alabama.
Sure. And
I think people have forgotten that. Then he comes in with COVID. So basically, you're in a system where it's really hard to get to know your other players around you. It's really hard to get to know the offense. And, we've seen him make some progression, but he also has a coach now who's really believing in him. They appear to have great communication, and he's certainly set up with everybody around him. So he's been handed everything. Time is favoring him now. I think you're going to see a big step forward from Tua this year.
All right, so here I come, being the wet blanket, though, right? I think in real football terms, I think Tua has a chance to make a big step forward. I think that if we are evaluating the fantasy merits, though, I have a tougher time envisioning him cracking the top 12 or 15 for quarterbacks this year. Now, best case scenario, certainly it's possible. But we're talking about a guy who has limited rushing ability. I know he's healthier, but still, he's not an elite athlete, right?
Yeah.
He is a fine athlete. He's not a statue, but he's also not anywhere close to Josh Allen or any of those elite quarterbacks that we have talked about as runners. I think Tua's a solid player. I think he's a solid passer. I don't think he is this elite distributor like Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert, who were in his draft class last year. And again, they have added so much talent around him. So it's tough to use last year's numbers as a metric. But last year, he had just 2 games with more than 18 fantasy points. There are other quarterbacks with like lesser talent around them who did that twice or even more during a given season, right? Like we just saw it, like there's not a ton of fantasy upside, and there was not a ton of fantasy upside last year. And I think there will be more upside this year. I'm just not sure I'm buying into it consistently because of the lack of rushing, because I think he's a fine passer, not a great passer.
So here's what I'm going to say relative to that. I think the fantasy upside is there. I agree with you. So you're not going to get a ton of rushing yards out of him, 100%. But he had receivers last year, particularly in Devontae Parker, who could not get separation. I think that is what's different this year. So if you tack on yards after the catch, suddenly a play that might have been a 12 or 15 yarder turns into a 30 yarder. Yeah. And that ends up being stats for him as well.
That's fine. So I just think in order to crack the top 10 or 12.
I'm not saying, I'm saying he has that upside. He has that potential.
Gotcha. Here's my thought.
I don't necessarily think he starts out there.
Yeah. I think I kind of want to split the difference with you two and we can move on. But the idea, I think that Tua is going to progress and be better this year. Period. That's going to happen. But I think that rather than being a startable fantasy quarterback on a weekly basis, Tua is going to have some really big boom weeks because of the skill position players around him, but I'm not necessarily sure when those weeks are going to be.
Right.
Yeah. And so I like him
I got
again.
him quarterback 16. So
right.
Yeah, that's I think it's probably hard for me to be in a top 12. Maybe top 15 is achievable.
But is he going to have a week with 300 yards and 4 touchdowns because he just happened to have yes, that's going to happen, but I don't not on a consistent basis.
And the quarterbacks this year, there are too many guys that you can count on already that he is below that line as opposed to above that line.
All right, speaking about below that line field, let's talk about Dolphins running backs.
I'll go with it. Go ahead.
Are they below the line of running backs that you want to have on your fantasy team?
No, not entirely below the line, but I do have some concerns. So I have Chase Edmonds highest amongst all Dolphins running backs. He is 30th in my ranks. That's ahead of his ADP, which is 35.
30th. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just did that thing that happens from this chair, but
it's okay.
30th as a running back means what to you? He's not a flex play, really. He's a guy that's
depth guy that if things break right could become a weekly lineup staple for me. Otherwise, he's best served for injury insurance. For one of my top 2 running backs goes down, bye week insurance. There's going to be obviously some weeks where things get very hairy.
Yep.
I think week 12 this year might be like the fantasy, the Armageddon week in terms of buys. So yeah, that would be what the 30th ranked running back on my list would qualify as.
Would you look at any of the other running backs, Stephania? Is there anyone else here that you even like? Raheem Mostert, Sony Michel?
Not for fantasy purposes. I think one thing is Chase Edmonds is getting a lot of run right now, right? Because Raheem Mostert is coming back. He looks good. Like as far as his knee goes, he had a big cartilage procedure. I think some people thought it was a cleanup. It's not. It was big, but he's back and he's running, but they have to acclimate him to football activity. So he's not going to get a ton of utilization now. But I saw Myles Gaskin out there. I saw Sony Michel out there. They're going to use a lot of running backs. But Chase Edmonds is getting a lot more in terms of the passing game. Chase Edmonds, they are utilizing a little bit more across the middle. So I think he does have, I agree, he's got the most value of all the Miami running backs right now. I think he might be a reasonable flex play early on, especially because they're not going to have a ton of depth at the running back position. I think he looks the best by far.
Let me just round out some of the thoughts from earlier on Chase Edmonds is that he got the most real contract out of all the running backs that Miami signed this offseason.
Yep.
Both Raheem Mostert and Sony Michel were on 1-year deals. Mostert's has a bit of upside. Michel's does not have much upside, so follow the money, right? As a matter of fact, Chase Edmonds got one of the better deals for all running backs this offseason. I also think, as Stephania said, if you had to just ask me which of these players is the best running back, I think it's Chase Edmonds. He's the best pass catcher out of these 3 running backs. Those are the factors that are working in his favor. The things that are sort of working against the tide in the other direction are that Sony Michel and Raheem Mostert, assuming they're healthy, do project to make the roster here in Miami and do project to have some role. And of those 3, I think that Chase Edmonds probably would be viewed as the inferior goal line option or goal to go option, even if he had some experience doing that in Arizona. As we saw last year, it basically became a James Conner show whenever they were near the goal line.
Yep.
Second of all, Raheem Mostert, big physical guy, right? Used to be a total bad you-know-what on special teams for Stephania's 49ers. Sony Michel, he is not super fast, not much faster than me, but he's powerful, right? Like, he's a powerful guy who played well for the Rams last season. So I think the reality for this Dolphins backfield is that there's only one of the three that I think has a chance to break through and be the weekly guy for the majority of the season. I think the much more likely scenario is that it's kind of hard to predict. This is Mike McDaniel. Where does he come from? San Francisco. Who was his former boss? Kyle Shanahan. What has Kyle Shanahan prior to last year often done? Like, hot hand here, hot hand there, right? So I think that there's a chance that this Miami backfield is split up enough that the value is just limited for somebody like Chase Edmonds, even if I think he's a good player.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm with you on the assessment of him being a bye week fill-in for me, because just like the quarterback position, there are going to be some boom weeks there, but I'm not going to know when to pick them from that standpoint. Unlike the wide receiver position, in which Stephania, you already let it off with Tyreek Hill. So I'm just going to ask you, based on everything that Stephania said about Tyreek Hill and the way that, the Dolphins are looking at him in camp, is he somebody that is still a true wide receiver one in fantasy this season with Tua under center rather than Patrick Mahomes?
Yeah, he still is a wide receiver one. I tucked him in at wide receiver 8 in my ranking. So of all the big name wide receivers on the move this offseason, I want to say he has the biggest dip in fantasy value based off of where I had him last year in my preseason rankings compared to where he is now. But he's only at wide receiver 8, right? So I'm still bullish on Tyreek Hill as a player. He's clearly the best vertical threat in the NFL still. He's extremely explosive. There's been talk, as Stephania alluded to not just throwing the football way down the field to Tyreek Hill. When he first got to Miami, there were rumblings about could he be Deebo Samuel, which, I think Tyreek Hill is super, super talented. I also think that there is a little bit of a give and take. The Deebo himself, I think, has to be mindful of like playing running back, but you're still a wide receiver, and playing a running back it's just a different physical toll on you than a wide receiver is. Yep. But so the upside for Tyreek is obvious, right? I mean, he's one of the best vertical threats we've ever seen in the NFL, and he's as good of a bet for a 50-yard catch in any game of any wide receiver in the league. I think the questions here are just how much Tua's game impacts Tyreek Hill's vertical ability. He's not Patrick Mahomes. That's not even that much of a diss. That's literally not a diss at all. No. Patrick Mahomes is one of the top quarterbacks, if not the top quarterback in the NFL. And then it is worth noting that even with Patrick Mahomes last year, Tyreek Hill has had some Jekyll and Hyde to his game in recent seasons. He had 8 games last year with under 12 fantasy points, 8 games in which he was outside the top 40 for wide receivers in a given week. So that's part of the reason why he's not in that top tier, right? Those guys that I mentioned earlier, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, obviously Cooper Kupp, Stefan Diggs, Devontae Adams. Those are the guys that if they have like 3 weeks outside the top 40 next year, I'd be surprised, especially someone like Cooper Kupp, right? So I just think that there's a little bit more yo-yo impact with Tyreek Hill.
That's fair. Anything you want to add, Stephania, or do you want to talk about his teammate?
No, let's talk about his teammate. I just think this is going to be interesting. Dolphins are one of the teams I'm most excited to watch from a football and a fantasy standpoint because we don't, like what you said, we don't really know how this offense is going to look. And we're seeing a lot of different looks right now as they're testing things out. And what you see, again, going back to Tyreek Hill, and I said this before, is that he opens things up for the rest of the offense because there has to be a focus on him because he's so dangerous. So wherever he is, he draws attention. And I saw a lot of action going to Jalen Waddle, lining up on the opposite side of the field, coming across the middle. Jalen Waddle is having a better chance at getting open because of the attention on Tyreek Hill.
Which is great for Jalen Waddle because last year he was very much volume dependent in that offense. And so for him to be able to continue that fantasy success that he had last year, that volume is going to have to be able to stay there. So
again,
does Tyreek take enough away to be able to give Jalen Waddle.
I was going to say, Jalen Waddle's best games last year were when Will Fuller was on the field. And that was for like a game and a half because that's all Will Fuller played. But having somebody who presented a threat created more opportunities for Jalen Waddle. Now you're going to have that all the time with Tyreek Hill there. And I think that's going to be a big game changer for him.
So this is on me for not having already checked where Jalen Waddle finished in the total points scored by wide receivers last year.
Where did he finish?
I don't know. I didn't check. I got to figure that out. I'm guessing it's probably ahead of his current ADP and his current ranking. I have him as wide receiver 15 on my board, wide receiver 14 in terms of ADP. So I think that the potential for lost volume this year, which, by the way, going down from 104 catches when you add Tyreek Hill, who had 111 catches last year, is not like that. That's logical. It's not going out on a limb, right? It was literally the most receptions by a rookie ever. So I think there's a chance that maybe Jalen Waddle lives more in the 85 to 95 range of catches this year. But I think that's offset by two important factors. Is I think that his yards per catch will be up. Last year, he was what Jarvis Landry was early in his when he played for the Dolphins during his first, I think, 5 seasons in the NFL, which was super valuable for fantasy. But he evolved. I think Jalen Waddle will evolve as a player. Again, he was, coming out of college, the guy that we compared to Tyreek Hill, right? So I think yards per catch are likely to go up. And I think that red zone opportunities are likely to go up as well for Jalen Waddle, because while I don't think this is, a nuclear offense, I think it is a more improved offense. And he had just 3 end zone targets last year. I think that number could double, triple, quadruple wouldn't totally stun me.
Okay, so this has me excited because now in talking about a better offense, more red zone targets, and hopefully the next step for Tua, I've been watching Mike Gesicki, who I felt like has been a wide receiver in the NFL for the last couple of years.
Oh, he's a big receiver. That's what he is. Let's be clear.
Take hopefully the next steps at tight end. But now I've heard Mike McDaniels come in and say, guess what, guys? Mike Gesicki is going to play a lot more inline this year. And it takes a lot of the excitement away around what I was hoping was going to be the next step for Gesicki. So, Field, I'm curious, when you look at him, is this somebody that you feel like is a player that you can trust as a tight end one?
I hate to minimalize some of our analysis on tight ends because I feel like more so than any other position, I just sort of put them into 1 or 2 or 3 categories, right? There's 1, which is like elite, start them every week. There's 2, which is just not going to cut it, right? If you're starting them, you're getting lucky if they pay off. And then 3, which is where we land most commonly, is you could probably start him. It might work out, but there's also the chance for like a 2-catch, 31-yard effort, and it shouldn't totally stun you. Again, I land the exact same spot here for Mike Gesicki. He is super talented. I mean, he's got one of the best catch radiuses in the NFL. He's 6'6". He's a former star volleyball player. I mentioned that because it kind of shows up on the field. Like his one-handed catches that he makes are amongst the most impressive in the NFL.
Yeah.
Problem is he a great bet to get 6 or 7 targets in a game? I mean, it's not a guarantee. He had 7 games last year with 5 or more targets. That means he had 10 games with less than 5 targets.
And that was before Tyreek Hill joined the team?
That's correct. That was before
Tyreek Hill joined the team. Yeah.
So he had 7 games with 5 or more. He had 7 games with 3 or fewer. Right. So you just don't know what you're going to get week to week. Different offense, no doubt. But it's hard for me to envision this role taking off because of all the players they've added. Not just Tyreek Hill. Yeah. Not just the running backs we've discussed. But they paid legitimate money to Cedric Wilson. 3 years, $22.5 million. Not a name that's on the draftable radar right now for fantasy, but tuck it away. Don't be surprised if early on it's oh yeah, Cedric Wilson is pretty darn good. Reminds me he could be this year's Kendrick Bourne for fantasy. Oh. Not going to have enough games that he's a must start or a must add or exactly when to start him. But it wouldn't surprise me if Kendrick Bourne, Kendrick Bourne too.
Kendrick Bourne also.
But Cedric Wilson has 5 to 7 games with 12 to 15 fantasy points.
I love it.
Stephania. I just think he'll be asked to do the versatility thing for a tight end, and they're going to need him up front to block, especially for the run game, especially early on, I think, as they're figuring that out. I mean, I saw him catch a couple passes. They're still throwing to him.
They are still throwing to him.
He's still part of the offense. They expect him. He will, I'm sure, have these games where it surprises you. He only had 4 end zone targets, I think, last year. I mean, they haven't looked for him in the end zone. We'll see if that changes. Didn't really see much of that in the single day that I was there. But that's what I'm nervous about, is how will he be called on from one game to the next? And that could vary a lot. I mean, I know we keep going back to San Francisco, but it's our best comparison. And look at what George Kittle did. George Kittle is fantastic pass catcher. He's amazing. But he's also a really excellent blocker. And when they need him to do that, that's what he does. And it's sort of knocked him down a bit in the tight end rankings as a result. So I just don't know how he's going to be utilized.
Funny how, so on the bottom of the screen right now, for those that are watching, they see a stat that is not wrong. Mike Gesicki ranks top 5 in terms of targets and receptions last year amongst all tight ends. And it's a reminder that sometimes season-long analysis can be a little bit tricky, right? Because top 5 sounds good. We also illustrated that it was boom or bust for Mike Gesicki.
Yes,
so a lot of those targets came in a smaller number of games, and then he had other games where he was a virtual non-factor.
All right, here's a question. Caesars has the Dolphins at 9 wins this season, added Tyreek Hill, a rejuvenated Tua. Stephania, you just watched them. You were there for a full day. You have at least 24 hours worth more of information than Field and I.
It's hard because I feel like they're right there. It's right at the 9.
That's why
like, I
know.
know. They're pretty good at that stuff in Vegas, I guess. I mean, it's it's like my heart wants to take the over for them, but I don't know. Like, look who they play against during the season. Buffalo, yikes.
Yeah. I'm going under.
Close.
Like the defense a lot. Big year for Tua. I'm going under. I think this is more like a 7 or 8 win team.
I think I'm going to go under too. The idea of them being able to get to 10 wins feels like a lot to me.
It does. I'm going to go with the 9. I'm going to go with the
You're going to go with the under?
Yeah.
Push. All right.
I'm gonna take, by the way, I didn't say this before, but I'm going to take the over on the Bills. I didn't say that the first time.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
Yep. To the moon.
All right. We're going to take a quick second to say thank you to our friends over at Geico. Geico asks, how would you love a chance to save some money on insurance? Well, of course you would. After all, who doesn't love a great deal, right? And when it comes to great rates on insurance for all things in your life, Geico can help. Like with insurance for your car, truck, motorcycle, boat, and RV. Even help with homeowners, condo, or renters insurance. You could even save more with a special discount when you bundle your coverages, plus add the easy-to-use Geico mobile app, available 24-hour roadside assistance, and more. And choosing to switch to Geico becomes an easy choice. Switch today and see all the ways that you could save with great rate quotes, with great rates and discounts. It's easy. Simply go to geico.com to get a rate quote or contact your local agent and get started seeing how much you could save.
This is important. This is the important part of the quarterback conversation. As I mentioned earlier, Josh Allen is my number 1 quarterback in fantasy this year. The case is clear. I think the bigger question, though, is where to take a quarterback in your draft. We're going to be doing an ESPN 10 or 12 team mock draft later on today, which will have some content to follow up on after the fact. But there is a big discrepancy between Josh Allen's current ADP and where I have him ranked on my personal top 150.
Agreed.
Josh Allen's current ADP is 24.0. That is number 1 amongst all quarterbacks. It's nearly a round ahead of Patrick Mahomes in 10-team leagues, who's at 32.2 in terms of his ADP. And just for some perspective, I told you earlier that I think that there is a 5-man tier for the top quarterbacks in fantasy. One of those is Tom Brady. He's going 72nd overall, nearly 5 rounds later than Josh Allen. While I bet on Josh Allen before I bet on Tom Brady as being QB1 this year, Tom Brady led the NFL in passing yards and passing touchdowns last season. He could easily be in that same vicinity. And really, when you're taking a quarterback early, it's not about whether that quarterback finishes as QB1. This is what we call value-based drafting in fantasy football, which is that Josh Allen could be the top scoring quarterback in fantasy this year. He was last year. If I said Brady was last year, I take Brady was 3rd. Josh Allen was the number 1 scoring quarterback last year. Year before, also the number 1 scoring quarterback in fantasy football. But it's opportunity cost. So if you're taking Josh Allen 24th overall, that means that you're bypassing potentially a top 8 or 10 running back, potentially a top 10 or 12 wide receiver, maybe somebody like Mark Andrews. So you ask yourself this question: would you rather have Josh Allen at pick 24, and perhaps somebody like Dalton Schultz at pick 74, where Tom Brady is going, 72, where Tom Brady is going? Or would you rather have at pick 24 Mark Andrews and maybe Tom Brady at pick 72? And I think if you were to be offered that trade in a vacuum, you'd probably lean towards Brady and Andrews.
Yep.
So my personal board for Josh Allen, I have him at 41st, which is the top of the 5th round in a 10-team league. I just am more inclined to load up on running backs and wide receivers early and tight ends for the elite ones like Andrews and Kelsey and others.
So I want to quickly share, we had a poll that we put up on the YouTube. How early would you draft Josh Allen?
Okay.
Poll came back. Rounds 3 to 4 were 49% of the vote. So in that 3rd to 4th round range.
Yep.
Rounds 1 to 2 were 25% of the vote. So way earlier than that. Rounds 5 to 6 were 19% of the vote, and round 7 or later. So I think the whole point of this is, if you want to, when I look at this, 75% of our audience says I'm drafting Josh Allen within the first 4 rounds of a draft, period.
Well, here's the other thing. When we talk about this all the time, if you really want Josh Allen on your team, then you may have to spend that capital, and that may be a decision that you make. I mean, to Field's point, I would rather have a big tight end. We all tend to wait on quarterbacks, but you have to know your draft room. And if you think that you're going to miss out because other people are going to jump early on the quarterback, then that's somebody you really want to have on your roster, then you're probably going to have to sacrifice and go early.
I'll tell you what, I took Josh Allen. We did a mock earlier this year. I took Josh Allen as my quarterback in the 4th round, which for the record is still like later than what it is that is he's going right now.
So that would be the top of the 5th round.
Sorry,
actually.
5th round
Yeah.
even. I didn't love the way that my team played out from the rest of my skill position players investing that 5th round pick in Josh Allen. Even when everybody else was waiting, I would have rather secured a better running back. Right now I have, in this mock, it was Kareem Hunt and I believe Rashad Penny were my RB2. I don't like
heavy
that.
on wide receivers and tight ends early.
I'm great on wide receiver. At wide receiver, I've got Deebo Samuel, I've got Justin Jefferson, I've got Darnell Mooney, and I've got Gabriel Davis.
Okay, so you went 4 wide receivers to begin the proceedings?
Not to begin the proceedings, but those are my 4 wide receivers. And so like I'm really thin at running back, and if I had not taken Josh Allen there, I'd have been able to take another running back in that spot and likely still been able to get like you said, a Tom Brady a couple of rounds later. So I think for me, just in going through the process, I like the idea of waiting and the point of doing mock drafts, for the record.
Yeah, it's helpful. And by the way, last thing I'll say is that like if you want to secure that quarterback spot, like there's nothing, taking Josh Allen's never going to come back to bite you in the rear in the sense that I think he's got the chance to bust, right? Like his bust rate versus some of the running backs that go around him.
So low.
So low.
So low.
But it just, again, this is value-based
value
drafting, something we'll
proposition.
talk about a lot over the next handful of weeks before the season.
All right, so Stephania, we talked today about 2 teams that basically have a running back by committee approach. And there's a lot of teams right now. I mean, a lot of our listeners.
More teams are doing it, by the way.
Way more teams are doing it.
More teams are doing it.
And we get so many questions within our Twitter chat, within our YouTube chat, everywhere, of how you go about handling situations like this. So understanding it is very dependent upon your team, how you're drafting. But when you go in just from a strategy perspective, looking at players that are coming from running back by committee teams, what kind of strategies do you take into that thought process while you're drafting?
I mean, look, I think that this is more the way, like it's rare that you have a dominant running back. It's rare that you have a Dalvin Cook, who's going to be doing just about everything at the position, and Alexander Mattison will step in and do just about everything at the position if Dalvin Cook goes down, but otherwise isn't going to be useful. Versus some of the teams we just talked about where you have the opportunity for multiple backs to play a difference and are probably going to be featured at different times or maybe against different defenses, et cetera. And I think it depends on the team because you need to know if you can predict a workload split. For example, in Denver, you've got 2 running backs. It's been essentially a 50-50 split. And I think that's going to hold true again this year. Yeah. So you know what to expect. You've got other committees where you have no idea how the workload balance is going to shake out. And I think so in those groups, they're the ones I'm really staying away from because you don't know who's going to end up with the bulk of the workload. If it's a workload split like in Denver, I'm comfortable with that because I at least know what to expect. So my strategy is probably to start early with a running back who I know is going to get the bulk of the workload. Even if they're not the Dalvin Cook person, they're going to get the bulk of the work. And then try and look at who gets the most touch of a running back in a workload situation, and then avoid the really complex committees until I have to go to them for depth.
I think pedigree matters a bit here too when I'm looking at running backs by committee. Like there are some where, like in Denver, Stephania just referenced, like both of those players are good players. Melvin Gordon's really good. If Javonte Williams was not available for the Broncos right now, Melvin Gordon would probably be top 15 running back off the board in drafts, assuming they didn't add anybody else. And obviously, if you flip that, Javonte Williams might be a top 8 running back off the board. Same thing in Cleveland or in Green Bay of either of those. Whereas in Miami, I think Chase Edmonds is a good player. I don't think he's at the level of some of the guys that we talked about. So when it's more like you're sifting through options like that where they're all fine, none of them are dominant, then I'm more likely to avoid them, especially when you play in an offense that you don't think is very good. We talked about it with Seattle recently. If it's an offense that has a chance to be really good, like San Francisco, you might take that late round lottery ticket and turn yourself into Elijah Mitchell. But, you know, the ones that maybe aren't going to be dominant this year, Seattle comes to mind as the most obvious one. There are a couple others as well.
I actually think the Rams is, that's a backfield I don't necessarily want a part of either, even though it's a strong offense.
I'm personally on Cam Akers, but maybe it's more of a split than we realize coming into the season.
But I think it's really the hard part sometimes with this question is it seems so easy to ask. Would you rather have Aaron Jones in the 3rd or A.J. Dillon in the 11th? And it's like, well, yeah, obviously I'd rather have A.J. Dillon in the 11th just because I'm getting him 8 rounds later. But that's not the way that the draft works out. You can't know that that's the way it's going to work. And so from that standpoint, Field, I love what you just said. When I'm looking at running back by committees, I am focusing, if I'm going to take someone, I'm making sure that they're on a good offense that's going to score a lot of points. I try to stay away from those running back by committees unless value dictates it because someone falls really far around those questionable running back situations on poor offenses.
There you have it. Agree on that. I think we got to go.
I think that's it.
We have to go. The bell has struck midnight. Actually, it's only noon, but whatever. There's the bell. We are back on Friday. We're going to do some double trouble, and we're going to have Bill Belichick on the show because he loves fantasy football so much, and he loves the Patriots.
That's not true.
Tune in tomorrow to find out whether I'm lying or not. Stefania hits the road once again. We'll see you. I'm not sure when, but we'll see you sometime soon. For Daniel and Stefania, I'm Field. Enjoy your Thursday night. Watch some football tonight. Yes. Who do you have? Who are you picking?
Jacksonville.
By how much?
104.
Wow, that would be a lot of points scored in the Hall of Fame games.
I don't know. Jacksonville's not playing any of their starters.
I don't know if the Raiders are starters. Come on.
Do yourself a favor, like when you're watching the game tonight, if you can name more than half the starters on the field at the beginning of the game, pat yourself on the back. You know too much about football or you have too much time.
Watch Snoop Connor, though. I actually really like him.
Yeah. No, Snoop Connor.